Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. My name is Lila Rothschild. I'm the program director here. And just to briefly describe EBF, we examine the ways in which awareness of our own mortality can affect our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. So today's topic is the death penalty. We have with us Phil Hansten, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington, where he teaches philosophy of science and drug interactions. He has been asked to consult on drugs used for lethal injection, and his recent book called Death Penalty Bullshit is a philosophical assessment of the arguments used by death penalty supporters. His work draws on Ernest Becker, among others, and I just want to say that Phil is a wonderful writer and he makes any topic extremely engaging, so highly recommend the book. Even for those who are not passionate about the topic, you'll probably become so after reading it. And also thank you, Phil, for shouting out the Ernest Becker Foundation in your book as well. That was fun to read. And moderating the discussion today, we have Christopher Hill. He's a lawyer and advocate with 25 years of experience serving disadvantaged people in our education and criminal justice systems. Chris also served as state strategies coordinator for the ACLU Capital Punishment Project. And his current work includes starting a nonprofit called the 13th Amendment Center to address issues of modern day slavery, such as mass incarceration and human trafficking through education, outreach, and policy advocacy. For more full in-depth bios, you can check out our website, the event page. And it's a pleasure to have both of you here with us today. So the format for today, Phil, he will give a short presentation and then we will be opening the floor to Q&A. You will be able to ask questions using the YouTube live chat feature, which is to the right of your screen. And before we begin, I would invite both of you to just say a few words about your personal connection to this topic, and then we can get into Phil's presentation. Phil, why don't we start with you?
With me? Okay. Yeah, about 10 years ago, because of my pharmacological background, I was asked to weigh in on some lethal injection issues. And so I worked on that for a while, but in the process of working on the lethal injection pharmacology stuff, I started reading about the death penalty itself. And I realized how absurd some of the arguments were. And this brought up my philosophical side, since I teach philosophy of science. Philosophers are always on the lookout for absurd arguments, and they abound in the death penalty. So that's how all this got started for me.
For me, golly, I was a first-year law student when I did any real advocacy. It's when New Jersey still had the death penalty, and I did a brief internship with the public defender of New Jersey, and they had a death penalty case. And from there, I was able to fortunately take the advocacy to the ACLU Capital Punishment Project after years of working for legal services organizations, and we were able to work to end the death penalty through, as I was strategies coordinator, through policy advocacy and legislative work. And we were either trying to abolish the death penalty or chip away at it to prevent certain people from being executed. So people who did not commit any crimes where there was a homicide, where there was no homicide. And I'd like to say that I was there when New Jersey and New Mexico ended their death penalties. And some of the arguments that you use in the book were arguments that we used in order to say this is why the death penalty should be legislatively abolished in the states. So it's a little bit of my background, and we'll talk about the background of your book, Death Penalty Bullshit. And we'll start now, Phil.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try to share screen here. And Okay, Chris, is that coming through?
I see it.
Perfect. All right. So we're going to talk about Ernest Becker and the death penalty. And the first thing I'd like to approach is this issue of the lack of logic and reason that supporting the death penalty. And I think Becker has some ideas that may help us identify why that's the case. But first of all, the question is, why do half of Americans support the death penalty? It doesn't reduce the murder rate. It sends a fair number of innocent people to death row. We'll talk about some of these in a minute. It's egregiously arbitrary whether you end up getting executed or not. It's not only for the worst of the worst. It's costly to taxpayers. We won't say anything more about that, but most studies, not all, but most studies suggest that having the death penalty is surprisingly way more costly than life in prison or long prison sentences. And it's self-evidently cruel. I don't know. This is one of the things that mystifies me. How could anybody think that the death penalty is not, doesn't classify as cruel by any reasonable definition of that word? So first,
really quickly, can I ask you a question about?
Sure, absolutely.
When people ask about support of the death penalty, where do the polls come from, and does it matter which questions are being asked?
Oh, that's a perfect point. Yes, because it absolutely matters what question is being asked. If you just say, do you support the death penalty or not, you're going to get a much higher support for the death penalty. If you say, what about the death penalty versus life in prison, then the support for the death penalty goes down substantially. So that's a good point, Chris. I should have mentioned that when I said half of Americans. If you give, and in fact, there was a poll in Dallas done a couple of years ago where they gave lots of alternatives. They had the death penalty versus or life in prison without parole, life in prison with parole after 40 years, blah, blah, blah. They gave all sorts of possibilities. The death penalty had actually fairly small support when you gave a bunch of other alternatives to people to pick from. Yeah, so that's a good point. Thank you for reminding me about that. It doesn't reduce the murder rate. You'd think it would. You'd think that, gee, if somebody's going to murder, they would think about it before they pulled the trigger, but it doesn't reduce the homicide rate. And if anything, and this is only a trend, so but it might even slightly increase. So if you look at states without the death penalty and states with the death penalty, the murder rates are higher in states with the death penalty. It's about 29% higher, at least in 2019. So if that's the case, why can't we say that having the death penalty increases murders? Well, of course, as you know, correlation does not mean causation. And that's the problem. So as much as we would like to be able to say this, or we would like to use this argument, in good conscience, we can't, because we're not sure that this increased rate of murders with the death penalty in death penalty states is causal. And good examples of causation, number of people who drowned by falling into pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. And another one, a great one, number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets correlates with per capita cheese consumption. So you have to be very careful. These are done by Tyler Vigen, he has a lot of these very interesting correlations, which obviously don't mean causation. So that's why we can't use that. Innocent people are regularly sent to death row. We're approaching 200 people who have been exonerated and released for reasons of innocence, not technicalities, but for reasons of innocence. And this is something that I would have thought that after the first 3 or 4 exonerations that we would have had, everybody would have said, no, let's do away with the death penalty. But this is not a rational debate, obviously.
Doesn't that mean the system works?
Oh, yeah. Oh, good point. Thank you, because that's what they say. Yes, Chris, that's exactly what they say. They say, well, look at all these people who have been exonerated. That means that the system works. Well, no, not really, because this obviously does not represent all of the innocent people on death row. The other thing is, once somebody has been, what it shows is how incredibly difficult it is to get an exoneration after you've been convicted. Because after you've been convicted, I tried to make a slide to show kind of like one of those traps for wasps where the thing gets in, but then it can't get back out again. Once you have been convicted of murder and sent to death row, your chances of getting that overturned are really small. Sometimes they're commuted to life in prison, but to being exonerated and released for reasons of innocence are pretty slim at that point. So it really just shows the people that were exonerated, but there are no doubt many others who are not, who are still innocent, who are innocent and still on death row. But of these 200, just a few, 4 or 5 examples: Anthony Ray Hinton, 30 years on death row; Ricky Jackson, 39 years; Manuel Velez with his sons after he was Velez was like 150 or 200 miles away from the murder scene when it occurred, and he had such horrible representation that he was condemned. Henry McCollum is an interesting case. He and his brother were released after 30 years on death row, and Justice Scalia used McCollum as an example. This is really amazing. He used McCollum as an example that just this case by itself justifies the death penalty because it was such a heinous murder. Now, it turned out, of course, McCollum was innocent. Somebody else had done it, and the person who actually did it went on and killed somebody else in the meantime because they put McCollum in jail. But so instead of being a perfect example of why the death penalty was justified, it was a perfect example of why the death penalty is not justified.
You know, the interesting thing is that was in a case, I believe, Kansas versus March, where Scalia pointed out the, McCollum and Leon Brown. What he doesn't say is that Leon Brown was had a severe mental disability. And he also, besides the fact, didn't say that there was questions about their innocence. I believe that was also the case where he claims that if there was any chance that anybody was innocent on death row, people would be shouting from the rooftops.
Right.
Well, the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty wrote, I believe, had an educational piece called "Shouting from the Rooftops," where they illustrate 4 people who were innocent and still executed.
Yes. And I don't know about you, Chris, but I've heard estimates from various people that really looked into it carefully that probably at least 20 people have been executed, innocent people have been executed in the U.S. It's just, they know for sure some, but it's probably larger than, and actually that's shown by this case here, Kevin Cooper, who's innocent on death row for 37 years. He's a friend of mine, actually. And some of you listening are probably friends of his as well. We're trying mightily, and some pro bono attorneys are trying mightily to get him released. He came within 3 hours and 42 minutes in 2004. He came within 3 hours and 42 minutes of being executed. They prepped him. They had him all ready to go. And if he had been executed, then nobody would have heard anything more about it. Just another, supposedly guilty murderer executed at San Quentin. But in fact, he didn't commit the crime, and it's still being worked on.
And I don't know if our friend Abe Bonowitz is here, but Abe is the founder and executive director of a group called Death Penalty Action, and he works closely with Charles Cooper, who is Kevin's brother. I believe that it's either Keith or Charles, I can't remember, but it's he's Kevin Cooper's brother, and they work together to talk about innocence and the atrocity of the death penalty.
Yeah, Abe does a great job. He is very passionate about what he does. We're not going to go into these. I just have a whole bunch of bullet points just to show you how many things make the death penalty arbitrary. The state and county of murder, money you have, skin color, all the biases, whether you have hidden some bodies. If you've murdered enough people and hidden some of the bodies, they're not going to give you the death penalty because you can negotiate telling them where some of the bodies are. So, it's just unbelievably preposterous. wishes of the victim's loved ones, resources of prosecutors, and we'll talk about mortality salience later. So the death penalty is capricious, random, and arbitrary, and getting executed is the equivalent of being struck by lightning. And I think Stephen Breyer hit it right on the head there. It is indeed. So equal justice under law. I mean, it's just amazing to me that the Supreme Court, isn't that what the Supreme Court has on its facade, Chris? Equal justice.
It is.
Yeah. And only about 1% of murders are ever executed. So obviously, you know, and it's not the 1% of the worst, as we'll show in a second. And the state where the murder was committed is important. The county where the murder was committed. Look at Texas there and see that it's only certain counties that, and by 2% of counties that we mean of across the country. But even in Texas, only some counties have the execute people. And how much money the defendant has is, yeah, Chris, you're going to say something.
I was going to say that some years ago, if Houston itself was a state, it would have ranked in the top 5 of jurisdictions that use the death penalty, which always begs the question: why would anybody in Harris County, Texas, murder anybody if capital punishment was truly a deterrence?
Exactly. Now I'm wondering if that dark blue thing is Houston that we see on that Texas map. Maybe. Anyway, probably somewhere near there. And money. If you have money, you don't get executed. It's just simply the case. So if you can light your cigars with $100 bills, you will never be executed. It just won't happen. So this guy is safe. He can murder as many people as he wants. He might go to prison, but he's not going to be executed. And so mortality salience, which is a Becker concept, and basically fear of death or terror of your own mortality, changing human behavior, which we'll talk about in a moment. So it's not for the worst of the worst. Jeffrey Dahmer was not sentenced to death. Wisconsin didn't have the death penalty. He was murdered in prison, but most people who support the death penalty say, oh, well, they're all like Jeffrey Dahmer. Well, that's not the case. All these serial killers got life in prison. And Gary Ridgway, because he had hidden bodies that he could tell the police about, so he negotiated a life in prison sentence.
And I believe that's after he passed a lie detector test.
Oh, was it?
You might get back to some junk science.
Oh, yeah, indeed. Yeah. So anyway, serial killers often don't, or not often, but sometimes don't get the death penalty. And Nathaniel Woods, who didn't kill anyone, he was in the room where somebody else killed some police officers, was executed on March 5th, 2020, even though he didn't kill anybody. I know, Chris, you've worked on this issue of death penalty for people who didn't physically kill anybody, right?
Right. In Texas, it's called the law of parties, or otherwise felony murder. But if you didn't kill anybody, you can just as easily, particularly in Texas with the law of parties, be executed. Yeah.
Well, and this was in, I forget what state Nathaniel Woods was in, Georgia. I can't remember which state it was in. I don't think it was Texas, but so there are other states that have the same problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then there are people that have been completely rehabilitated. Scotty Murrow was executed, and before he was executed, corrections officers, judges, psychologists, social workers, guards, everybody spoke out and said, look, he needs life in prison without parole, not to be executed. Everybody across the board. One person said, one of these officials said, he's the best person in the world. He makes the prison safer. He does, they went through all this stuff, but they didn't listen. They had to have their pound of flesh. They had to execute this guy, even though it made no sense whatsoever. And Nicholas Kristof asked in a column, was this man, Scotty Murrow, who was strapped down on a gurney, truly the same person as the enraged brute who had shot dead Young and Woods 25 years earlier? There's no question about his guilt, but complete rehabilitation based on prison officials' opinions, it wasn't enough. And the cruelty, I just don't, again, to me, how could you have to redefine the word cruel if you're going to say the death penalty isn't cruel? And it's not just the execution itself, most of the problems occurs before the death penalty. And Arthur Kessler, and a lot of the books you see, or about 6 or 8 of the books you see on the shelf back there are by him. He wrote 2 books on about the death penalty. This one was on dialogue with death. He was on death row. Kessler was on death row in Franco's Spain, and he described in this book a number of how the condemned prisoners were behaving and what they were going through. And Carlos, who Kessler spoke German, so he was called in to help talk to Carlos. The sweat was pouring down his face and little bubbles of foam had formed on his lips. This was all just terror of impending execution. His eyes were wide open. They poured a bucket of water on him. He came to and began to whimper and wave his hands about. We felt his legs, they were stiff as pokers, and the knees would not bend. He became unconscious again the next day. So he describes, and I mean, it's a horrible thing to read, but it does give you the idea of what it's like to be on death row waiting for execution. It is, and to call this, to say that this is not cruel is is truly amazing to me. And then, of course, there's executing innocent people, which we already talked about. Innocent men have been hanged in the past and will be hanged in the future. This is the other book that Kessler wrote. In my view, one of the best books ever written on the death penalty. It's very analytical, but it has a lot of philosophical overtones. It's just an incredibly well-argued book. And so he says, we will hang innocent people in the future unless either the death penalty is abolished or the fallibility of human judgment is abolished. Now, I don't know what you think about chances of that second one coming about, but I think it's pretty slim, especially since we have to be told not to cook chicken in NyQuil, and we do stuff like this. So I think that the possibility that we're going to do away with human fallibility and stupidity is 0. So what that means, of course, based on Kessler, is we either have to abolish the death penalty or we have to fix human fallibility. So which one of those is going to be easier to do? And Adam Smith, yes, the Wealth of Nations guy, wrote this book, which was an outstanding book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he said, an innocent man brought to the scaffold by the false imputation of an infamous or odious crime suffers the most cruel misfortune which is possible to suffer. So now to Becker. So why is this so irrational? All of these things you would think would cause us to say, no, the death penalty doesn't make sense, which most of the rest of the civilized world actually has done. So something else is going on. It can't be logic and reason, because if we had logic and reason, then these would do away with the death penalty. So something else is going on, and I think Ernest Becker has something to say about that. His books, which those of you who are Beckerites know all about, and a number of legal scholars, and Chris, you have to explain to me why when legal scholars write these gigantic articles, the footnotes are more than the actual writing. You have to read those things, don't you?
Yes, I do. And tenure is the reason.
That's a perfect answer to that. It was actually a very well done article by Donald Judges. And he wrote an entire article, I don't know, it's 40 or 50 pages long, about Ernest Becker and the death penalty. The title of the article was Capital Punishment as Authoritarian Terror Management. And he pointed out that the forces underlying capital punishment, while readily responsive to fear-based communications, are remarkably unresponsive to reasoned objection. So he's answering my question for me. This is because the death penalty is more symbolic than practical. It is also because those forces operate largely outside of conscious awareness. So this is unconscious fear of mortality that changes our behavior, is what this scholarly attorney is saying. So we like to think of murderers as being like this guy here. This is the typical example of what a murderer would be like. And so we have to destroy them. They're evil and we get to destroy them. And Solomon et al. In Worm at the Core, excellent book, talking about Becker's ideas and then bring it up to the current day. There's always the lingering death anxiety that humans project onto other groups of people whom they designate as evil that must be destroyed. Ironically, then, when a good deal of evil in the world results from efforts to rid the world of evil. And others have said this, including Solzhenitsyn, et cetera, that destroying evil, saying that we're going to destroy evil actually often results in evil. Here's Solzhenitsyn's comment: if only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. This is I think one of the best things anybody ever said. It really cuts to the, no pun intended, to the core of this issue. So Becker's thesis is, and by the way, there have been, and you Becker people could tell me more about this. I know at least 500 empirical studies have been done on Becker's thesis, and the vast majority of them support it. Not many, my field is drug interactions. We never have 500 articles supporting a particular drug interaction. So it's a fairly well established, there are issues here and there are things that people disagree with, but overall, the overall theory is pretty well established. So the terror of death, which we all have as humans, causes us to deny the finitude through cultural meaning or other things. Sometimes we have positive things. We make a scientific discovery, or we write the great American novel, or we do positive things that give us meaning. But through most of us, it's through cultural meaning. So the next box down, threats to our culture from people not like us result in punitive attitudes towards these people labeled other. And most or many of the people accused of murder are in out groups of one type or another, usually a racial minority or somebody with a different religion or socioeconomic status, et cetera. So terror management theory, which Solomon, Greenberg, and Pazinski came up with, is that awareness of our mortality results in terror, and cultural meaning can assuage this terror. And so reminders of mortality, which is called mortality salience, can increase negative behaviors toward the other. And people accused of murder are oftentimes considered the other, innocent or not. So TMT, and this is from Donald Judges again, TMT terror management theory suggests that the fear of death leads to hyperpunitiveness, and Keynote doesn't like the way I spelled that, but I think I spelled it right. It's got it underlined in red. Aggression and authoritarianism, all the kinds of things that would cause somebody to support the death penalty and support the conviction and execution of people accused of murder.
And how does this play out in the courtroom?
Well, I'm going to talk about that actually, but it plays out in the courtroom in that. First of all, there's usually a grisly murder, and so everybody, the jury, the prosecutors, the judge, everybody involved in the case has death right in the front of their mind. And when that happens, and this is what has been shown with this mortality salience down here, when people are reminded of their own death or reminded of death in general, then this leads to all of these kinds of urges. And this is what's pretty well established through studies. So what that would tend to do then is cause, and I'll show you in a moment what happens to, in fact, I think I have it next, judges who all of a sudden change their behavior, and the jury especially. I think of all the areas where this death awareness causes difficulty, it's with juries. And although the judges, as you can see here, let's give this example. This is one of the first examples that they used way back. This is from 1989, where they took 22 judges, and this was just one of the initial studies to see, well, does this reminding people of their own mortality, does that really change behavior? Well, they took 22 judges And they randomly assigned 11 to think about their own mortality on the left there, and the other 11 to think about other things. Then they asked all of these judges, now you're not going to believe the results of this. You're not going to believe it, but it's really true. And they were all asked to set bail for a prostitution case. So those judges that had been reminded of their own mortality, it was $455. This was a hypothetical prostitution case. The people that had not been reminded of their own mortality was $50. Now, when I've told people about this, they're incredulous. They don't see how this could possibly be the case. But the other 500 articles or 500 studies looking at this mortality salience have found similar results. So there's no question that being reminded of your own mortality changes your behavior, usually negative behavior towards other people. Not everybody is as susceptible as somebody else. If you have high self-esteem, you may not be as susceptible to this kind of thing. So, as Solomon et al. Said, the scales of justice were tipped, if not toppled, by the judges who had pondered their demise. So it also affects police, detectives, prosecutors, everybody. It increases conscious and subconscious thinking about death. And then this then leads to more aggressive attitude towards outgroups, other people. And especially, I think the jury is probably the biggest recipient of this mortality salience problem. Seeing courtroom evidence of a grisly murder is likely to increase their subconscious death anxiety, especially if the victim is the same race and social class as the juror. If the victim is not, then it's, I could turn off my watch real quick here. Okay. If the victim is a different race or much lower social class or whatever, then they may not relate as much to it. In other words, it may not, it may, so on the other hand, if the victim is, if the juror is white and the victim was white, then it may cause more death anxiety for them. So the other part that where it affects juries, and this was brought up by this guy, where is he? Kirchner, who also a lawyer who wrote a scholarly article on Ernest Becker and the death penalty. And he pointed out that jurors must support the death penalty to serve on a capital case, which in my view is one of the most ridiculous things we could possibly have come up with. But you have to be death qualified to serve on a death penalty case. So people that are more susceptible to negative behavior towards the other due to death anxiety are more likely to be they're more likely to qualify as a juror on a death penalty case. And studies have shown, according to Kirchner, and I think it's true, are more likely to convict. So he said, Kirchner said, well, the defense should try to get jurors with high self-esteem because they're less likely to be affected by this. But the problem with that, of course, is that those with higher self-esteem and have more things going on in their life to make them feel okay about themselves are less likely to be supporters of the death penalty. So, and then finally, for the accused, and this, I think, is pretty self-evident that if the thought of our finitude, our mortality, is so overpowering and terrifying, a person on death row would have no escape. The terror of death would always be there. So forcing a person to confront death for years or decades is in my view, is the ultimate cruelty. And Albert Camus, Camus wrote a companion piece to Kessler. Kessler wrote a piece on, they were buddies, Camus and Kessler were buddies. And until Camus started having an affair with Kessler's wife, that kind of put a little damper on their relationship. But Camus and Kessler wrote companion books, really, small books, short books. Camus in France wrote Reflections on the Guillotine, because that's how they killed people in France. And Kessler wrote Reflections on Hanging, because that's how they kill people in the UK, which is where he was. So Camus' piece was a bit more philosophical, but also very rational. And he said, when our official jurists talk about putting to death without causing suffering, they don't know what they're talking about. And above all, they lack imagination. The devastating, degrading fear that is imposed on the condemned for months or years is a punishment more terrible than death. Another French thinker, Simone Weil said, when she was talking about people, before I talk about her, she was talking about people who are facing death. She said, when people are facing death, the mind is then strung up to a pitch that it can stand for only a short time, but each new dawn reintroduces the same necessity, and days piled onto days make years, or in our case, decades. On each one of those days, the soul suffers violence. Regularly, every morning, the soul castrates itself of aspiration, for thought cannot journey through time without meeting death on the way. She was a beautiful writer. And so I think that it's clear that the fact that this mortality salience, thinking of, fear of death, it has to be on the minds of people on death row pretty much constantly.
A few years back, there was a lot of talk about what was called death row phenomenon, and it dealt with just that the longer you spend on death row, it can drive you crazy. And a lot of death row is being spent in solitary. And if you're not in complete solitary confinement, you're spending 23 hours in a cell and 1 hour outside in not a very large space in some places. And it will drive you crazy. And not just the thought of your own impending death, but when you watch other people die or people go to the death chamber, will also affect you mentally.
Yes. Well, Chris, that's a really important point, because first the issue of solitary confinement, and I know you know much more about this than I do, but just from my relationship with Kevin Cooper, who I visited at San Quentin, every now and regularly, he'll say, well, I can't have any visitors for the next 3 weeks because there's been an incident and we're all in solitary confinement. And so at the slightest drop of a hat, these people are placed in, and like you said, 23 hours a day, they are anyway. So it's just a horrible thing that these people have to go through. But the thing about watching other people, there's, I forget his name, the name of the death row inmate who was exonerated, but he talked about, it was not one of the ones we've talked about, but he talked about what it was like to watch those other people. He was on NPR, he actually interviewed on NPR, and it was riveting, him talking about what it was like to watch his fellow inmates going off to be executed. And he said it was just beyond what many of them could even tolerate. So okay, so now we're at the end, and so I think what we're doing basically is we're sailing without the ballast of reason. The sails are being filled with urges of revenge and fear of death, and all of the emotions and passions that go along with it, with murders and capital cases. But without the ballast down below, the ship is not going to be on course, and our ship is definitely not on course. We need somehow to introduce more reason and rational thinking into this death penalty debate. And I think that Ernest Becker could help us, some of his ideas could help us at least identify where the problems are and why we have this problem of not being able to use rational thought. And maybe once we see partly using Becker's ideas and see where the problems lie, maybe we could start to somehow address them. So that concludes my portion. So I'll turn it back over to Chris. And I'll stop share. Oh, you're on mute.
Anyway, so that's my brilliant conclusion on how we can. I'm kidding, because I was on mute. But I wanted to talk about your book, and while you mentioned some of the reasons, you have 15 claims in your book that people who are in favor of the death penalty use in order to use as arguments that the death penalty works. So some of them you mentioned, like the worst of the worst are the people who get sent to death row. Innocent people haven't been executing innocent people hasn't been a problem, as well as sending innocent people to death row hasn't been a problem. Forensic science will eliminate sending innocent people to death row. The appeals process for those on death row ensures that innocent people will be detected. Executing innocent people is no worse than people dying in accidents. District attorneys who resist claims of innocence for people on death row usually act in good faith. Having the death penalty reduces the murder rate, which you also mentioned. Evil people are fundamentally different from the rest of us, and we can identify them. The death penalty is necessary to achieve justice for the victim and their loved ones. Lethal injection is a humane way of executing people. It is irrelevant that all of Europe abolished the death penalty because the Holocaust occurred in Europe. We need the death penalty because life in prison costs taxpayers too much. We need to execute people because inmates with life sentences can kill more people in prison or can escape and kill again. And the 15th claim, people who oppose the death penalty are bleeding hearts, criminal coddling commie liberals. And the one thing you claimed was valid was that I don't care if the death penalty is egregiously arbitrary, sends innocent people to death row, may increase the murder rate, costs way more than life in prison, increases suffering for many loved ones of the victims, is undeniably cruel, is based on vengeance rather than justice, privileges my moral sentiments above those of others, and brutalizes society. I just like the warm, fuzzy feelings I get when someone gets executed. That's the true claim. So we have 15 false and 1 true claim. So when I recommend this book to you, I recommended that you, those who are opposed to the death penalty have likely used some of these arguments before. This book is chock full of not only reasons, plain spoken reasons to debate those claims, but also uses philosophers and experts in other fields in order to show that these claims aren't real. And so I suggest you pick up the book. And Phil, for this book, where you really break it down for people, you also have another academic book that deals with the death penalty called Outmatched.
Right. Outmatched, the death penalty meets the wisdom of Montaigne. And that one is a lot bigger. It's kind of outdated, but it's free on Apple Books if anybody wants to get it. But it's outdated compared to this death penalty bullshit one that just came out months ago.
So one of the things I want to get to is one of the claims that the death penalty is necessary to achieve justice for the victim and their loved ones.
Yeah, that is a really important point, because that's one that at least for some loved ones, and certainly not all, because there are a number of loved ones of the victim who are against the death penalty and try valiantly to have the person have a long prison sentence instead of go to death row. And the horrible irony is that prosecutors, and not all prosecutors are like this, but prosecutors may go against the wishes of the victim's loved ones and go for the death penalty anyway, even though the victim's loved ones tell the prosecutor, no, this is going to increase our pain. We're already in pain. We're going to have increased pain if you go for the death penalty, and they do it anyway. So that gives the lie to them saying, well, we have to worry about the loved ones. The other problem is the other major problem is that the loved ones may not realize that their pain will be increased in the long run if they go for the death penalty, because they have all these appeals they have to go through. And it just keeps on tearing the scab off the wound over and over and over again. And so loved ones, I think the ones that are able to move past it the most easily are the ones that just say, okay, let's, life in prison. And then they don't have to worry about all these death penalty appeals cases or dates that they have to go. And especially a problem if the accused succeeds in any of these appeals, then they feel like they've lost. So it's not really always in the best interest of the loved ones to go for the death penalty.
And there, I think you mentioned that there are times when where the family members say, "Please don't do this.
Yeah,
we'd rather you not do this." In North Carolina, there was a man named Elias Seriani, whose family, he killed his wife. His family said, "Please spare him." The children went through moments of where they wanted him to be executed, but then they got to the point where, if you kill our father, we will have no parents. And the state of North Carolina executed him anyway. And there's a book, a film by a woman named Linda Booker called Love Lived on Death Row about that case specifically. And it's interesting that this is just anecdotal, but there have been so many cases that I have seen where when prosecutors and the families want the death penalty, they'll scream the victim is crying out from the grave for justice. And if you tell them, well, the victim opposed the death penalty, well, then we have to do it for the state to save, to show that we will kill the most heinous of murderers. So they don't really, it's as district attorneys and attorneys general are elected positions. They can often do what they believe is politically expedient than what is right for the families.
Exactly. And politics sometimes is involved in I mean, it's clearly involved in some of these cases when a prosecutor is coming up for re-election, and being tough on crime is important to his, to at least some of his constituents. But I think you make an excellent point about it's not just the person on death row who's suffering, that person's family. The person who is condemned, their family is suffering. In fact, one of the first people I talked to about this when I first got involved in the death penalty was a guy who owned several pharmacies in Washington, D.C., and one of his employees was a woman whose son was on death row. And he said to me, "You would not believe how she suffers, how this woman suffers with her son being on death row." And that was one of the reasons he became involved in the death penalty, was because seeing this woman suffer day after day. And it's not just the family and they didn't do anything. I mean, why they're being punished, but they didn't actually do anything. And the other thing is that look at the people who work in the prisons. I mean, there's more and more coming out now about the people that actually perform the executions or are somehow involved. And, some of them are macho and claim that they're not affected, but wow, I think that forcing, or even if you get volunteers or give them extra pay, people to kill another human being is a pretty horrible thing to do to the prison workers.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there are many wardens, I can think of Rob McAndrew, and executioners. Jerry Givens was a guy from Virginia who passed away, I believe. And they all say this has had a great deal of effect on them. Some of them can't go back to work.
Yeah.
And then they all started out as the most macho person. Yeah. This has to be done. I want to be the first to pull the press the plunger.
Right.
And later on, it has destroyed them.
Yeah. Well, in the book, I tell about a case that was described by Kessler, I believe, and he talked. It was a judge who had fought in the First World War, and I'm old, but I'm not old enough to remember that. And so, and he had seen all the carnage. I mean, it must have, from all the stories, it was just unbelievably horrible. He came back from the First World War, became a judge, and he said there was only one case where he decided to go see the execution. It was just a straightforward case. A guy had murdered his daughter, and he said he went to observe that execution. It was the only one he ever saw, and he said, I had nightmares. He said, I saw the carnage of World War I. I saw people dying everywhere. I saw bodies everywhere. He said, watching that execution, that judicial murder, he had nightmares for months afterwards. He was never the same again. And so it wasn't somebody who hadn't seen death, but there's something about the calculated killing of a human being by the state that just he couldn't stand.
Okay. We have a question from the audience. The question is, can Becker/terror management theory help explain why for some people life in prison is not enough and it must be death? For some people is the only thing that can assuage their own death anxiety, the death of another. How can we remedy this? So those might be separate questions. So let's start with the can terror management theory and Becker explain why for some people life in prison is not enough and it must be death?
Well, one of the issues about life in prison versus the death penalty is that, as you know, Chris, many people call life in prison death in prison, because it means if it's life without parole, it means you die in prison. And I've talked to Kevin Cooper about this and listened to other people talk about it. For many people, life in prison would be almost worse than the death penalty. And so whether one is better or worse than another, I'm not sure if I could come up with a good way that terror management theory affects that issue, to be honest. But it's certainly true that some people commit suicide. Some people on death row just commit suicide. In fact, it happens, I don't know, you might have the data on that, Chris, but it's not uncommon for them to commit suicide.
Well, it's the amount of people who suffer with mental illness on death row, or people in prison in general, and not just because they're in prison. They often self-medicate when they're free, and then they commit crimes. And there was a guy who was not exonerated, but granted clemency on Ohio's death row, named Jeffrey Hill, who killed his mom because he was addicted to crack. And that was eating him up inside already. And so to execute him was not going to, it would have been cruel and horrible for his family, as well as the state, because there are plenty of families who understand addiction and understand what people will do and what lengths they will go to feed that addiction, even when they know that that's not anything they would want to do.
Well, Chris, you've written on the issue of people with disabilities on death row as well, and I mean it's pretty high percentage, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of us write about the people with mental illnesses. I was trying to take it from a different angle, the people who are suffering from physical addiction, physical disabilities, and some of that is caused by addiction. So they all have smaller veins, or veins that they are not easily used in a lethal injection setting. And it's just ridiculous to try to execute them when we're so bad at it. The guy who, Dr. J. Chapman, who created the 3-drug cocktail, said, I would not have invented this if I knew complete idiots would be in the death chamber. And it's factual.
Yeah.
And even people who are qualified, like doctors. There was a doctor in Missouri who was just said, I'm not really good. Sometimes I get the numbers mixed up, and I might be a little dyslexic. And then he backpedaled from that and said, I just sometimes mess it up. Um, how can we remedy through terror management theory dealing with anybody's death, on death row, the victims' families, and even maybe the prosecutors? Is there any way to deal with that?
Well, I think that for me, the main value of Ernest Becker's ideas in terror management theory would be to try to do what some of those legal scholars have done, and try to identify how this impacts on juries, prosecutors, inmates, all the people involved. And once we have a better, I think it's more of I don't think Becker's ideas or terror management gives necessarily solutions, but I think if we can use those concepts to identify what's going on, in other words, why are we so irrational about dealing with the death penalty, that maybe those insights will help us come up with ways of addressing it. That's my hope. I mean, it hasn't really been done extensively yet.
One of the things that trial lawyers do, started in Colorado, is the death penalty. The capital cases have two phases. One is the guilt innocence phase, and one is the life death phase.
Right.
And lawyers try to do, and in order to get the death penalty, you have to have more aggravating factors than mitigating factors in order to receive the death penalty. That's the theory. And if there's no
Right.
judicial override, and you have to have a unanimous jury, that's how that can work. And so what they do is front load the mitigation. So meaning that they start with trying to get a juror who is maybe death qualified, but also kind of leaning towards not executing anyone, who could lean towards that, who can look at it fairly, not looking at it through a bloodthirsty lens, but
Right.
maybe if I hear this story as we go along, and I can learn what's going on in this person's life, instead of waiting till the life death phase. We might find a person who will lean towards finding, maybe finding the defendant guilty, but will spare their lives. And so that may be a way where unconsciously terror management theory works. My cat wants to chime in on this. Big Becker fan. He
Excellent.
We could get in a few more questions. So please do, Lila, if you like. I would like to, but while Lila gives us the next question, I'm one of the things you mentioned were prosecutors, and a professor from Mount Holyoke stopped calling things wrongful convictions and called them unlawful convictions, because prosecutors were outwardly, holding back evidence, breaking the Brady rule, which is Brady says that you have to provide all exculpatory evidence to the defense.
Yeah, well, and you would know far more about this than I do, but obviously prosecutors have enormous power over whether or not to seek the death penalty, and how to handle it, and whether or not to try to commit Brady violations, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, their power is just, I mean, as a citizen, I have to say, I find that just preposterous, that one person can make all these decisions and decide whether to plea bargain, if it's not a death penalty, all these things. They have all this power to pretty much, I mean, the legal system is pretty much the prosecutor. It seems to me, as an outsider, I don't know if I'm overstating it, but am I overstating it?
Well, there's a lot of people involved. And so law enforcement, even before it can get to the prosecutor, can have tunnel vision and focus in on one client, and get them to falsely confess. And once the false confession starts, the ball starts rolling, and the next thing you know, we have an unlawful conviction.
So they have conspirators. The prosecutors have conspirators.
Indeed. And so somebody asked, does the death penalty protect society from professional criminal murderers? In other words, does any research show that the death penalty deters crime more than life in prison?
You know, that's an interesting question, because Kessler, in his book written in 1957, mentioned them. He went through all the kinds of people that commit murders, said, well, it's deterrence not going to work for them and them and them. But right at the end, he said, but professional killers, it might work against them. But I am not sure he was right about that, because if you're a professional killer, you have a pretty high opinion of your ability to not get caught. So I think even for Kessler acknowledged that maybe those people would be affected by deterrence, but I don't think they would, because I think if you're going to be a professional killer, you're going to figure that you're never going to get caught. And only 1%, that's the other thing, 1% of murders result in an execution. So your chances are 99% chance you're not going to be executed.
Yeah, and if you're a serial killer, you have a pathology that I can't begin to understand, because I'm not a psychologist or know anything about the field of psychology. And the other thing is, if you're talking about somebody who's like an organized crime murderer, I think the same thing applies, is that this is a person who's going to do this anyway, and deterrence
right
not going to work. And the only thing is specific deterrence. Maybe that person won't do it again, but it doesn't deter anybody. And it'll go back to the statement, if the death penalty was a deterrence, why are there any murders in Houston?
Well, exactly. And that you bring up a good point about the serial killers. D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer here in California. Well, he was in other states too, but in California. And they finally caught him using DNA stuff. And he was a horrible, horrible murders this guy committed. I mean, raping and murders. And I mean, he just did some really heinous crimes. Well, it turned out that when he was a kid over in Germany, he was playing with his sister. I think he was at a military base over in Germany with his parents, and he was playing around on the base with his sister. And some people came up and grabbed his sister, and raped his sister. Some military people did, and he watched this, and. And he started, right after that, he started acting out, starting having all sorts of problems. Now, you cannot say that I would never try to claim that experience is why he turned out the way he did at all. I would never try to make that connection. But to me, that's not the point. The point is, can you say for sure that were it not for that horrible trauma that he went through, he would have done these murders anyway? Can you say one way or another? And the answer, of course, is you can't say, probably not, but maybe, in a lot of the murders, and I'm sure you have many examples, have suffered horrible abuse and sexual abuse and beatings and, all sorts of terrible stuff that they've experienced as kids. And whenever that happens, I think the question is not, well, can you prove a connection between this abuse they suffered and their crimes? It's, can you answer the question, were it not for that abuse, would they have done that crime? And you can't answer that question. You simply cannot answer that question. If you can't answer it, then I think your life in prison is a lot better option.
And just to piggyback on that, there was a man in North Carolina named Ronnie Fry, who was executed, and he was literally the poster child for child abuse. I mean, they put him on a poster and said, if you see a child looking like this, he's being abused. And then later on, he committed a murder and was executed. Somebody asked, for those who haven't read the book yet, can you briefly address the research showing that the death penalty is not cheaper than life in prison? Well, I can tell you that, and they thank us for our work. or at least you. I can tell you that there are many studies done even by states. So you can, if you go to the Death Penalty Information Center's website, you can find a lot of information on that. And you'll find that there are states like Tennessee, the Office of the Controller, who found that the death penalty costs more than putting somebody for life in prison. And there was a Duke study that I believe that gets updated every so often, that about how expensive the death penalty is as compared to putting somebody in prison for life.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, absolutely, the Death Penalty Information Center, if they just go to that site and look at what they have to say about cost, it starts to make sense that it's not as clear cut. I mean, you'd think that having somebody in prison for the rest of their lives would cost more than just killing them. But and I do talk about in the book about why that's probably not the case. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them is, just one reason, is that even if they do get the death penalty, they're typically in prison for 15 years or so anyway. And so, there's a lot of expense. So you're not saving, and then the trial costs way more. You have to have, the trial has to, you have to have expert witnesses. And so the state has to pay a lot more to pay for the trial. But I think your point that going to the Death Penalty Information Center is the way to go, because they go through each of those issues one by one and explain it. It's counterintuitive. When I first heard that, I thought, well, how could that be? But I think the preponderance of the evidence suggests that it costs more.
Yeah, it costs more based on the use of the courtroom square footage. This is what the Duke study showed. And also there are appeals, and people will say, well, then just end the appeals. Well, in Gregg versus Georgia, the way they were able to get the death penalty reinstated after Furman versus Georgia made it outlawed it, so Supreme Court decisions, they provided that you had to have a direct appeal in order to have a capital punishment scheme in your state. So if you want to get rid of the appeals, then you have to get rid of the death penalty, because you will be going against exactly what the Supreme Court said you needed to have in order to make it less arbitrary. And they still haven't made it less arbitrary. The direct appeals don't work as well. But if you're going to do it, you got to win a trial or win in the direct appeal, because once you get into the system long term, as you mentioned in the book, it's not guilty until proven innocent. I mean, innocent until proven guilty. It's guilty until proven innocent.
Right.
Somebody asked, if fact, statistics, and logic on the death penalty being more expensive is not effective deterrent, cruel, what is the hope for a more just democracy moving forward? Do we both believe that education around psychological concepts can help with policy and advocacy? I'll let you answer first.
Yeah, that one's tough, because, and really, I think in many ways, we need to educate the legislators. And interestingly, there are some Republican legislators. I mean, there's an organization called Conservatives Concerned About the Death Penalty. And I would recommend people go to that website too, because you see a lot of people you would never expect, very conservative people who are against the death penalty. And the reasons for conservatives being against the death penalty are one, the cost. I mean, they do accept, most of these people, conservatives, accept that it's the cost is a problem. And they also focus on the fact that it's a government program, and they don't think the government can do anything right. And so they do not think the government is going to be able to prosecute death penalty cases correctly. So cost, it's a government program. And some of them bring up the innocence thing. And that, I mean, nobody, I don't care if you're liberal or conservative, nobody wants to execute innocent people. Nobody's for that. And so, they're worried about that. There might be another argument, I can't remember what, but there definitely is a core group of conservatives who are, it's not pro-life. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if they're claiming they're pro-life, then they can't be for the. They see it that those two don't go together, being pro-life and executing people. So those four reasons have caused a lot of conservatives to speak out against the. It's not a majority by any means. It's still, but it's a vocal minority.
But it's it's a strong vocal minority nonetheless, and they're helpful in the argument. I would also say that folks should look up the James Liebman study. He's a professor from Columbia University, where he talks about how often just death penalty verdicts are overturned until life in prison. So you spent all that money, but also we're just bad at it. And Frank Baumgartner, professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, has said that if people lost their mail at the rate that we get death penalty cases wrong, we would lose our minds. We would have a conniption. I'm paraphrasing, but he's absolutely right. If the government is just terrible at this, from all the way around, from the trial, when you put somebody on trial, you spend all that money. You can't be for small government and spend that kind of money.
Right.
Particularly if you're going to put somebody who killed 48 people that you know of away for life. And the only reason we think of him is because there's 100,000 shows on true crime now. But the person who has killed the convenience store clerk for drug money and has been executed doesn't get talked about a lot. But that's the person who gets executed, and that's not the worst of the worst. All murders are bad, but if you're going to say a person who deserves to die, and if it's not the guy who kills 49 people and has something to hold over the government, like finding the body or helping the family, why wouldn't you just do that for all families and just put this person away for life so they don't have to think about it? And I can't think of any family who has ever said, we've gotten closure off of this. I've never seen a murder victim's family say, hey, this has been cathartic for us and now we have closure, because you're never going to get that loved one back.
No.
Somebody also said in the chat that death does not bring life back to others. So true. And go ahead, Phil.
Well, I mean, that's so true. I mean, it's like Holly Near said, how preposterous it is that we kill the killers to prove to the throng that killing is wrong.
Exactly. And here's our final question. For those who have no way out of death row, is there a way for them to gain any meaning in what is left and perhaps help them not suffer as much? What would Becker think, or either of us, have to say about this, as long as the death penalty remains in effect?
Well, again, Chris, you would know more about this than I do, but I just know it from from the San Quentin prisoners that I am, Kevin Cooper, who I visit, and others that are friends of his. And Kevin is a beautiful artist, and so he does art. He writes a lot, and Jarvis Masters, I think I'm saying that name right, has written books on Buddhism. He's a fellow death row inmate and probably also innocent. And so I think that for those that have something like that to do, it can at least, especially those that are innocent and are hoping that someday they're going to be released. But for those that don't have that kind of thing to do, it must just be horrible. I don't know.
Well, get the mental health care. Just because they may die doesn't mean that they don't deserve good medical care. There are people on death row who've been diabetic. Help them. Provide them with the proper medication. Prison. I understand why people believe prison should be purely punitive, but it should also be rehabilitative, even for people who may not get out nor may die at the hands of the government. If Pat Robertson could think that Carla Faye Tucker Brown had a life worth living in prison, then surely everybody in prison has a life worth living.
Right. Agreed.
And so we appreciate it. I'd like for you guys to look at, I still have a bookmark in there, sorry. Death Penalty Bullshit. It's a great book. It's a great read. It's quick, and you'll learn really a great deal of lessons. And you will find that there are some villains in there that you may know. That's, and they're not anybody on death row. They're people who are clamoring to kill more people or have the state kill more people.
Right.
Thank you both so much for your discussion today and just your thoughtful, insightful commentary. And everyone who attended, thank you so much for your questions. Yeah, I just also want to second that this is a really great read. I think, even let's say if someone did commit a murder and the evidence was irrefutable, which doesn't always happen, but let's say that zero doubt at all, no chance of a false conviction. Someone might say, yeah, the death penalty is cruel, but they did inflict that terror on someone else. They took a life, so they don't deserve their life. I think that this book really answers that question of why, even in that case, the death penalty is still not the answer. So I really encourage everyone to take a read, I guess, and also Phil's other book on the topic, as we mentioned, your other death penalty book. And then in terms of the Ernest Becker Foundation, if you enjoyed this webinar, please consider supporting future webinars by making a donation on our website or linked in the description to this YouTube video. And if you're interested in keeping up to date with future events and webinars and news at the foundation, you can join our monthly mailing list by signing up on our homepage. Do either of you have any other final comments before we close?
No, I'd just like to thank you for the invitation. It was really excellent. And thanks, Chris, for the excellent questions and commentary.
Thank you. And I really enjoyed this. And I hope the audience did as well.
Thank you both. Thanks, everyone.